with power.
Good evening. Welcome to GreenWatch, your locally produced progressive political and social affairs program. I'm your host, Brian Harrison. Tonight, we're going to devote the hour to America's foreign policy with members of the Houston Foreign Policy Alliance. It is a new group that brings together folks from the left and the right in order to critique and change America's foreign policy and militarism. With us this evening are Jeff Larson and Bob Henschen. They are both part of this new group that is organizing here in town to change America's foreign policy. First, Jeff and Bob, welcome to the program.
Great to be on.
Thank you, Brian.
Let's first start and talk about the group for a second. What do y'all hope to do as the Houston Foreign Policy Alliance? What's your goal or your aim?
What we're trying to do is affect U.S. foreign policy. And to do that, first we had to understand what kind of a policy we wanted to search for. And it was very important to us that we be able to reach out across the political spectrum. And so we've got people from all different parties and different points of view, and we've searched for common ground as to what we think a more efficient, more effective, and a more sane U.S. foreign policy would be.
I have to say that I've looked at it as an experiment. Mm-hmm. The idea of bringing left and right together, and to see if you could find points of agreement about foreign policy among left and right. If then you could take that to the public and eventually have an impact on policy and how you do that. And we're kind of working our way through how we can do that. But we have done the first part, bringing the left and right together, which is quite an accomplishment in itself, and it's been a wonderful process.
It's interesting because it kind of reminds me of, like the Justice League of America or something from the comic books where you get all the superheroes together. But so how does this start? How do you get folks from the ideological left and the ideological right in the same room to talk about foreign policy?
Well, I think there was a deliberate attempt to reach out and do that. And I guess maybe you were more involved at the beginning of that, and you could talk about that.
This group grew out of a conference that was held last April at TSU, sponsored by the Houston Peace and Justice Center, which is a nonpartisan organization itself. I was in the planning for it, and in the planning process, one of our members came in and said, there's a book out by Ralph Nader, Unstoppable, the coming left-right convergence to dismantle the corporate state, or something like, I can't remember the exact name, but it's Ralph Nader's book from 2014, I believe, early 2014. And he made the point throughout the book that there are many points of agreement in various parts of the left and right. And some of those points were about foreign policy, and we were planning a foreign policy conference. So we thought, well, you know what? That would be a unique effort and approach and maybe attraction to see if we could bring some people from the right into the peace and justice folks that normally put on events like that, and to see what kind of event we would have, and to see what kind of impact it could have, and then to perhaps see what could grow out of it moving forward. As it turned out, we had a wonderful conference, brought in some great speakers, had a very low attendance, It's not easy to get people out to a foreign policy conference, and we were, a small group doing it. But we videotaped it, so it's available for our use. And the group has such a productive relationship putting the conference together. We said, you know what? Where do we go from here? What if we kept this group together and then moved on to see what we could do to bring left and right together to work on reforming U.S. foreign policy?
So that's try to organize here as a left and right group. Mm-hmm. What about the possibility of conflict? I mean, I'm thinking about this, and a lot of folks, I would talk to some communists that we've had on the show, and they were praising parts of Ron Paul's foreign policy back when he was running for president. That's a crazy thing to think about. But there is some agreement, but there's also a lot of disagreement.
Sure.
What about the possibility of conflict? How do we deal with that?
Took it as it came. A lot of it was when we were putting on the conference, we had to search for common ground, or else that just wouldn't have happened. We needed to reflect, we needed to get speakers in who reflected different points of view, but most of the speakers, this being focused on, the points that we had agreement on, we found speakers from both the left and the right who subscribed to similar points of views on foreign policy. So we kind of danced around that to start with, and we're very, kind of feeling each other out and making sure that we weren't going to come at each other. And then that went so well that, like Bob said, we decided to see what we could do afterwards. And one of the first things we ended up doing was, putting together a sort of a formal statement of purpose and what we're trying to do, and we really had to be on the same sheet of paper to do that. And what we found out was, there were certainly points where we disagreed, and those didn't make it into the document. And the points where we could get together did. And that's really the glue that keeps us together, is looking for that common ground and agreeing, knowing where to agree to disagree.
And if you look at, and we'll get into the resolution in a moment, but when you look at it, it's very clear that there's a strong critique that both elements of the left and the right share of foreign policy and militarism in the United States today. And that it seems possible, at least, that folks can come together and organize around that critique.
I think it's going to open some people's eyes on the left and the right, that there is this common ground. There are points where the critiques are pretty much the same. And, they have to do with intervention. Mm-hmm. They have to do with the military budget. They have to do with civil liberties. And they have to do with executive overreach in terms of war-making powers, for example, and other. But those are big areas. And then the question was, could we flesh out some recommendations, not just critiques? And so it's taken us, I guess we started by about June, we decided that we needed to write up these points of agreement, and it was suggested that it could become a resolution with whereases and resolves that people could sign on to. And so that's what it became, and that's what we're just launching now, is that but we were able to work through and work around and come up with something, realizing that we don't have to agree on every point to make a contribution to changing foreign policy in the right direction.
Well, it seems that just a critique almost is enough, because there is very little discussion about foreign policy, and certainly none at all about militarism and trying to cut down the military budget in this current presidential election. It's the only thing that I've heard any candidates talk about, foreign policy related, is ISIS. And then I remember also this Benghazi business with Hillary Clinton. But do you agree? I mean, is this remarkable that we're not talking about foreign policy in this election?
Well, yeah, but you have to kind of look at the whole history of the thing. We, in my lifetime, people talked about the Cold War for years and years and years, and that was sort of a lot of people saw that as an existential threat to the United States. So it was something that was important in many people's minds, right up there along with, am I going to get a paycheck this week? And after the end of the Cold War, that started to go away for a little bit, and then we had 9/11. And now it was a different kind of a threat, and it was very personal. The saying, all politics is local. Well, if the terrorists are going to come to my backyard and my shopping mall, that's pretty personal. So people got involved in that. But now, that was, 15 years ago, and the immediacy is fading, I think. And that's why you're not seeing this anymore. People don't see a huge threat other than what you just mentioned, ISIS, and people are frightened.
But yet we still continue to spend, is it $1 trillion a year on the
It's
military
about,
budget?
yeah.
We continue to have drone strikes in other countries. I heard just earlier this week there was a massive drone strike in Somalia, and I think 100 civilians were killed. It seems like our foreign policy continues even without the public's attention on it.
Yeah.
And it's just not being discussed in this election. What are your thoughts?
I don't think it's unusual, because most elections are about the economy, it seems, in my recollection. And unless there is a foreign policy emergency on the table that month or that week, it's mostly going to be about the economy. And this year, the election is just about personalities and
It's bizarre and twisted, I think.
insults and tactics, and it's not even less about policy than usual, much less about foreign policy. So making proposals like this, I mean, we have a hard row to hoe to see how we can focus America's attention on what's going on around the world in our name, why we have these problems, and what's a better way to deal with them than the way people propose and have been dealing with them or trying to deal with them in the past 15, 20 years.
It seems to me it's remarkable that neither party is really talking, or no candidates for either party are talking about foreign policy and militarism. It seems like there's a consensus amongst the two big parties that that's okay, that's acceptable, that's business as usual, and we should keep our foreign policy in an aggressive state. We should keep our military large and big and expensive. It almost seems like talking about changing any of that's the true third rail of American politics. And where there's a convergence here on this table, left and right, there's also a consensus of the Republicans and Democrats to keep militarism, to keep foreign policy aggressive and postured forward. What are your thoughts?
Well, you know, I'm very fond of telling people, and I get a lot of negative reaction on this, but that foreign policy in the Obama administration with Hillary Clinton as Secretary of State was really very, very similar to the tail end of the Bush administration. Now, it's changed a little bit with Kerry, but you know, what was remarkable to me as someone who has been observing foreign affairs for years was just how much continuity there was in principles and in actions and the whole approach to the whole thing. I've seen that explained in terms of, you know, the situation drives the response, but that's not, I don't think that's a complete answer. And I really think that unless you take a step back and really re-examine your principles and what you're really all about, it's very tempting to just sort of follow along in the footsteps of your predecessor and fool yourself that you're really making changes when you're really not.
You know, one part of my thought about the experiment, and I think it was the thought of the planning group when we said we need to do a foreign policy conference. Our organization, the Houston Peace and Justice Center, has done things about this kind of economic justice, environmental justice, criminal justice, domestic policy issues. And those are easy to organize around. Foreign policy is kind of like who knows anything about it, what groups are there out there that want to be presenters. So we felt like, okay, we need to do this. And when we took this approach of looking into the common ground between left and right on the critique, it made us start to think that, well, you know, the last 15 years of war in the Middle East, if it were properly addressed to the public with credible voices, it's a teachable moment. It's time to take a look at that consensus of the Republicans and the Democrats on an interventionist foreign policy. The U.S. needs to dominate in order to be safe. And no questions asked. Just keep spending the money, sending the weapons, sending the troops as needed. And so we're thinking that, you know, that's why we have started to reach out to military people, especially retired, when they're not, you know, when they can speak, who are critics. And those voices, I think, need to be heard. And so that's one thing we think we can do, is to bring those voices to bear on the situation so that it'll get a hearing. So there won't be just assumed that since the Republicans and the Democrats seem to agree that we need a big military budget and to have bases all over the world and to intervene as the leading force in every conflict around the world, that there might be a question that we need to look at, and that we hope we can open up that space where it's been seen as the consensus, because that's what both parties do.
And Bob, I think that's exactly what the country needs, because if you look at opposition, and pardon me, Jeff, my knowledge is going to be almost exclusively of sort of on the left-wing opposition to intervention. They always pop up when the wars happen. Okay, we're going to bomb Yugoslavia. Okay, then we're going to have groups that come up and organize rallies and teach-ins about the war in Yugoslavia. Okay, now we're going to go bomb Iraq. Then you have groups that come up to oppose that. But there's no long-term systemic, foundations or foundational groups that oppose intervention altogether and the military altogether. And it's something that we've experienced here on the show, to knock the fourth wall down. It's hard to find people to come on and talk about foreign policy because the groups largely don't exist outside of times of immediate war. And that kind of points to one of the difficulties of organizing locally on foreign policy. It's never been something that's gained traction because there's no real groups that are interested outside of the military. How do you overcome that?
Well,
as a million-dollar question,
as a kind of a fledgling organization, I'm not sure that's really a fair question. I would say ask me again in a year, but no. I mean, I think it's gone fairly well. With it's one thing that helps is we're here in a large city, and it's a very cosmopolitan city, very international city. Everybody knows somebody who's from someplace else. There's an educated population here. We have many universities, and all these things provide us with a pool of talent. There may, on a percentage basis, there may not be that many people who think about foreign policy issues on a daily basis, but in a large enough area with these kinds of resources available, there's a pool to draw from, and we've been fortunate in that we've been able to find people here in the area who are interested. And then the next step, of course, is, to put on things like conferences, to get critiques of policy statements and stuff like that. We have to reach out beyond the area, and fortunately, when you expand to a pool the size of the United States, there's a lot of people who are willing to look at your stuff and give it a critique and help guide you along. So I would say thus far, that's how we've gotten over that hurdle, or at least gotten a good look at that hurdle and got a good run up to it.
Just as in the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, there seems to be this ongoing consensus about intervention and the military approach to foreign policy. If you look at the public education that goes on in Houston about foreign policy, whether it's the World Affairs Council or maybe the Baker Institute, people that put on conferences, it's that narrow consensus. There may be some differences, but I think our goal would be to start trying to bring in the other voices, to bring them in to those kind of forums, and to create other forums, and to make some news. And I think we're hoping that because we have this unique coalition building, that it would be newsworthy. And that's another reason people, once they see some of the names of people who actually support this kind of critique in a different approach, would begin to discuss it. It would become part of the discussion. If this group didn't exist, I agree, we would go on with the way we are. The American people need to look at our foreign policy. I think we've been lulled with fear mongering since 9/11 for sure. Into thinking that there's only one approach to dealing with the world we live in. And so it's a hard road to hoe, but we think we have a role to play, so we're just going to do our part.
And you do have some endorsements that were actually, y'all released, I think today or yesterday, that include people who were formerly high-ranking military officers. Why? We didn't have an opportunity to put the names up on the screen, but they're certainly there on your website, which we've linked to a couple of times tonight. Why would somebody like the former Chief of Staff to Colin Powell, why would he begin to criticize an interventionist foreign policy?
Well, they're.
I don't mean him specifically. That came out bad. But why would such a military officer come out and be Well, and start discussing ways to, pull back on our interventionist foreign policy.
Well, their job is not to espouse a certain policy or to serve a particular point of view or a particular administration or even a particular institutional mindset. Their job is to preserve, protect, and defend the country and defend the Constitution. That's their job. And if what they're doing, if the policy of the day starts getting out of whack with that, they see it as their duty to bring that issue forward and say, hey guys, we need to make a change here, we're doing something wrong. So that's why you're seeing that. It's out of, I'm convinced from having talked to some of those people, it's out of a sense of duty.
And another thing is, these are people, and another person, and the person you're talking about, Lawrence Wilkerson, also came out of Vietnam experience.
Yeah.
They know the human cost of these policies. It's not just something on paper to them. So they take it very seriously, and when they see human lives being wasted with ineffectual policy, when they get a chance to, sometimes they are very willing to speak out, and it's so wonderful when they do, because people will listen to them in a way that they won't listen to me or Jeff. These are people who have been inside of government. They have supported the military. They support the military in certain circumstances. And in other cases, they feel that diplomacy is a better approach. So they're really making a strong point.
And there's also the endorsement of, I think it's John Dorschner, who was retired Foreign Services, so I believe that's a diplomat. So you've got some former diplomats who are also being critical of this, talking about.
That's what we're hoping, by reaching out with this document that we created, that we will be able to pull in foreign service people, retired military people, as well as business people.
Yeah.
We believe that there are folks out there that, having looked at the experience of the Iraq War and the cost to the economy in many ways, that there are people in those communities that understand as well. And so we want to start presenting a broad coalition that says it is time to question this approach. Look at the results. And I think people, given the right spokespeople, will say, you know what? If there is a better way, we probably ought to look into it at the very least. That's what we're hoping.
Well, go ahead.
Jeff, if you've got a response.
Well, we're certainly trying to reach out and to hit those communities, and there are a lot of, one community you didn't mention was academia. There's another one. Pretty much every American is affected by this, but even if they don't, the effects aren't in their face, and something they think about every day. We talked earlier, we mentioned the figure $1 trillion, and I want to come back to that for just a moment, because if you look at the budget, a lot of people will say, well, it's $650 billion, it's not $1 trillion. Well, but that doesn't really cover all the costs. You need to lump in things like the VA as part of the cost of going to war. The interest on the debt, that part of the debt that is used to finance that other $650 billion, that adds up. When you add up all those little incidentals, it does come to a little over $1 trillion. That's, that's a fifth of our, not fifth, that's 5% of our budget. The entire gross domestic product of the United States. So it really does touch and affect everybody. And so just about everybody, I think, should have an opinion on this and should be aware of these costs. And reaching out to all those different communities, I think, is really our mission here, and it's a good one.
We are talking with members of the Houston Foreign Policy Alliance. It's a new left-right convergence group devoted to changing America's interventionist foreign policy. With us tonight are Jeff Larson and Bob Henschen. We are going to start talking about their resolution, which came out last month, calling for changes in America's foreign policy, after these brief announcements. That does it for our announcements this evening. We're now going to rejoin our panel from the Houston Foreign Policy Alliance. We are joined by Jeff Larson and Bob Henschen. to talk about changing foreign policy. We've been dancing around this issue of the resolution. Let's go ahead and get into it because contains there's a lot of points in there, but it's relatively short. It's only a page, and it contains a powerful critique, I think, of America's foreign policy. Let's talk about it. First of all, I get the sense, and correct me if I'm wrong, that y'all's position is that conventional warfare as we practice it, boots on the ground in Iraq, drone strikes in Syria, Somalia and other countries, these are things that America needs to stop doing.
I wouldn't say that. And what I would say is that we rely on it too heavily.
Okay.
That should not be, and every politician, it seems, on both sides of the aisle gives lip service to this and says, oh, well, that will be our last resort. But it really doesn't seem to come across that way. We really seem to be going into war and putting boots on the ground more often than we really should. So I think what we're really calling for is a smarter foreign policy, one where we use all the tools at our disposal instead of relying on force and military firepower.
You know that old saying that when you've got a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. Is that something that the United States is suffering from when it comes to its foreign policy?
I would say so, and when you build a tremendous military machine at great expense, and as Eisenhower pointed out, have a whole industry making money from it, it has a certain tendency to perpetuate itself and to have to find uses. When the Cold War ends, the war on terror conveniently becomes the justification for keeping the military budget growing, even in the absence of the great power confrontation that we were concerned with after World War II. But the other side of that, and we have a person in our group who is a retired Foreign Service person, is that one hammer is not a hammer, really, is diplomacy.
Yeah.
There is so much that can be done with various types of assistance, with various types of pressure that is not military pressure, working things out, bringing people together, and as Jeff said, our position is not disband the military, never intervene anywhere for any reason, but much less militarized foreign policy, and be emphasizing the diplomatic, the non-military approaches as the first resort and the military as the last resort, and that there's so much ground in there to be made use of that we don't make use of, where it's too easy to say, or you feel under pressure to show that you're stronger than the other party or the other candidate. I'll do this to them, no, I'll do. So the wrong kind of pressures are pushing us into these policies which backfire, which leave us with unintended consequences, with blowback, that then we send in another military answer to that and find that we're in another quagmire. So we're hoping that the American people, having had this experience for the last 15 years, will say, we need to look at what are the alternatives to continuing down this road. And so we're not saying disband the military, but take a look at the acceptance of military as the first resort in these, or the only resort as the assumption.
So Jeff, are y'all calling for a non-interventionist foreign policy? Are you calling for an isolationist foreign policy? What single word would you use to describe foreign policy that y'all are advocating for?
I think I use the word smarter, and that could mean a lot of different things, but to me it means effectiveness, it means bang for the buck, and almost anything that explodes is very, very, very expensive. So that really needs to be the last resort. When I see things like, and one of our points is that we have like 700 military bases around the world, and no, that's not an exaggeration. At one point, we had an Air Force base in Uzbekistan, and I don't think most people can even find Uzbekistan on the map. And you have to ask questions like, why, how do we get to that point? Is that really appropriate? Is that really the way we want to approach the rest of the world? Is that the right way to protect our interests? And we don't think it is. We think maybe scaled back, but even that's a little misleading. Really, and to come at it from the right, one of our former candidates for president said, "You can't project world power from bankruptcy court." That plays into it too. There's a component of this where we're just spending too much money and not getting what we're paying for.
Another point that you all talk about is this concept that there are a lot of tripwires from these old Cold War alliances and Cold War positions. And that made me think about some of the kind of unwise talk around Russia's intervention in Syria. What are your thoughts about this issue about old alliances, tripwires, contained in foreign policy that may no longer even be useful?
I can talk to that a little bit. We recently had a situation where Turkey shot down a Russian airplane. Taken to extreme, that could have, if Russia would have reacted to that, Turkey would have been within their rights to go crying to NATO that we're at war with Russia, and now all of a sudden the U.S. is at war with Russia because Turkey shot down a Russian plane that was on a mission in Syria. That kind of reminds me a little bit of the run-up to World War I and how all the different nations of Europe had all these alliances and really a web of alliances, and they all got into a war that none of them really wanted because they felt obligated to do so. I think it's one of the points we're trying to make is that we need to go back and look at all these obligations that we've laid on ourselves. Some of them are 50 and more years old, and they really don't make sense anymore now that we're living in a different world. We're not living in the Cold War world anymore.
Bob?
I think Jeff's word smarter relates to treaties. Mm-hmm. You don't just assume that these obligations are justified because we made them 40, 50, 60 years ago. And so we're advocating, among other things, a reevaluation of treaty obligations that could be tripwires into a confrontation that's unnecessary, not in the U.S. interest. And another word, as well as smarter, is a more realistic foreign policy. To look at the world the way it is, to look at what the threats really are. There's such a thing as threat inflation, and also to look at the U.S. interests in a realistic way. What are, not to assume that the control to our advantage of every part of, of the world is worth the downside, the military effort, the expenditure to dominate, to be dominant, and to question that approach. That in order to be safe, we need to dominate, which I think coming out of the Cold War into the unipolar world where we're the only superpower, and the question is, where did we want to go with that? Do we become the policeman of the world at that point? Is that our role? Is that in our interest? Does it work? So we're for raising those questions, along with the questions about treaty obligations.
And in this resolution, you all use that phrase explicitly, policeman of the world, and you call on the United States to stop trying to be that. Folks on the left and on the right may criticize that a little bit and say, oh, it's an appropriate place for the United States to be the policeman of the world. On the right, for instance, folks may say we need to protect our interests in different parts of the world. If you look at the Middle East, clearly we have an energy policy interest. You look in other places, there are American interests that need protecting. Jeff, what would be your response to that type of a criticism?
I would use your exact words. The two key phrases are policemen of the world and key U.S. interests. We don't think it's in the U.S. key interests to be the policeman of the world. And if you think about it, what does a policeman do? If there's a domestic dispute at a house on the other side of town, is the policeman's job to go out there and settle that dispute. But is that really in that policeman's vital interest? Now you would say, well, that's his job, and you'd be right. But where is it the U.S.'s job to settle a dispute between, say, for example, pick any two countries halfway around the world that do not have large oil reserves and that are not part of a tripwire or anything like that. And so you look at some of the actions we've taken in places like, for example, Libya, and places like that. How do you really justify that as being in the vital U.S. interest? I mean, it's not like they're a major oil exporter or that the European economy is going to collapse because Libya is not pumping oil or because Libya is having internal strife. So you have to look at things like that and ask what are really our vital interests. And you realize pretty quickly our interests come in layers. And some are at the top, and there are things that you would have to go to the mat for. And other things are not really that important. They're things we would really want to do. And other things are things that, well, it'd be kind of nice to do, but it's really not our job. And when you separate those things out and you're a little more honest about what are our interests and what aren't our interests, then you arrive at a foreign policy that says, being the policeman of the world and running halfway around the world to settle a dispute between two other nations, that's really not our job.
So then you would call on folks on the right and politicians on the right to really reevaluate what our interests are and,
yes.
and reprioritize those interests so that we're only involved in areas where we absolutely must be.
That's right.
Bob, from the left, some folks may say some of these interventions have been to protect humanitarian interests. For instance, I brought up Yugoslavia from the 90s. A lot of folks were saying, that's the right thing to do because there's an ongoing genocide. A lot of folks, some folks at least on the left, have been calling for some type of intervention against ISIS because they have been, frankly, oppressive and brutal. What would be your response to that?
Well, I think our general response is that we should have a high bar in making these decisions in the first place, to intervene or not. And how to intervene is a whole range of options. Right. So, you want to open up this question so it's not just immediately go with plan A and send in the Marines and bomb and use the heavy-handed approach, which I have to say, and I think people are starting to see, is usually ineffective. In the cases, many of the cases we're talking about, the collateral damage does more harm to the people, does more harm to our task, to our own relations. You look at the unintended consequences, the blowback from these military operations. You have to realize that we leave open the possibility that there may well be times when a military intervention is justified. Now, even in that case, who is in charge of it? Under what auspices? What's the best way to rethink this so that it's not the U.S. always leading the cavalry and being responsible? I think we need to back up, and I think people on the right as well as the left are beginning to say, why are we spending the money to defend wealthy countries in Europe, for instance, who are able to downsize their military, prioritize other types of spending, and rely on Uncle Sam, even though we begin with the point of view that the policy doesn't usually work anyway, but that it's really a question, is this in our interest to take that responsibility as the leader? As though that's the only way we can exist in this world in a safe way. And I think we're saying let's reevaluate that approach.
You know, talking about unintended consequences, you know, this humanitarian argument for involvement against ISIS, it's mind-boggling to me because ISIS, there's a pretty good argument, is an unintended consequence of our involvement in Iraq. So these involvements are getting involved militarily in these places. Oftentimes doesn't work out. May even make situations worse. In fact, oftentimes has. We're in the resolution. Y'all also talk about nuclear weapons, which is, I don't think I've ever heard. I don't know if Barack Obama's ever said that phrase. It's just something that American politicians and folks that talk about politics just don't discuss. And y'all are bringing that up. Why a criticism of nuclear weapons and a call to draw those weapons numbers down?
Well, they're tremendously expensive. And effectively what they serve is a deterrent. There was a need to have large numbers of nuclear weapons when we had an adversary that also had large numbers of nuclear weapons, and that doesn't exist anymore. So now the real question is, how many nuclear weapons, what kind of nuclear weapons do we need in this current era? Is our force balance appropriate? And you know, that's not just a question for a handful of generals. That also needs civilian oversight. We need to have people in the government and people outside of government looking at that and asking that same question and finding their own answers. And you know that there's certainly treaty obligations that we're already hooked up to that we can use. People tend to look at those and say, well, they would cause us to maybe reduce our forces. But the flip side of that is those same treaties could be used to encourage other nations to reduce their forces too. And I think pretty much everyone agrees that at least down to a certain point, the world is a safer place with fewer nuclear weapons.
Bob, what are your thoughts?
We have to address nuclear weapons. They have the potential to do the most damage on this planet. They are also a major security interest in terms of who gets a hold of them. So it's a major issue that we don't talk about in this country. I'll also say that when we were working on this a year ago, the situation in Ukraine was on our mind in this country much more than it is this year. And so you had the United States and Russia having that relationship become tense. And we're still looking at incredibly armed countries with nuclear weapons and planes being shot down. And so we believe that part of a better foreign policy will be to take a close look at how can we reduce the number of nuclear weapons and to tighten up whatever needs to be tightened up to make sure that there is no access by, to wherever that problem may be, to look at it that way as a safety issue, as long as we are living with them as a deterrent. That needs to be part of our proposal, is how can we lower the risk. And the other thing, if you've read the paper lately, it doesn't get much play, but the United States is deciding now to modernize. It's not like we're just sitting around with these weapons. We're starting a multi-year modernization plan. If we modernize, somebody else is going to say, well, I guess we better and then we're back where we were during the Cold War, and that's not a good place to be. We survived that, luckily. And we definitely don't want to have those risks increasing. So whatever we can do to decrease it, which fits in with the treaty obligations and using the diplomatic rather than the military approach, it's a part of the whole picture that we want people to look at.
These are big picture, or these are big issues, big picture issues. Kind of pulling away from the resolution for just a second. The costs, expense, and frankly, just worldwide danger represented by nuclear weapons, and they just hardly get discussed on the campaign trail. The ongoing quagmires and messes that we involve ourselves in and create with an interventionist military and a foreign policy. Once again, never really gets criticized. Why aren't politicians dealing with these issues in a realistic and in a thoughtful way?
I'd say it's a combination of so many things, but a lot of it comes back to all politics is local. And, you know, if you go back 30, 40 years, you had a population where there were a lot more veterans. They'd seen the face of war, and they understood what was going on with the Cold War, and the last thing they wanted was a nuclear war in their backyard. And so all these things were immediate to them, and it was more in the national consciousness. And if you look at the electorate today, the demographics have changed quite a bit. There's percentage-wise, there's very, very few veterans compared to what we had, say, 30 years ago. And so these issues just aren't on people's minds. We have the economic situation where people are concerned because for the first time in their lives, they may be handing off to the next generation a country that isn't better than the one they grew up in, and that weighs very heavily on people's minds. And so all those things together tend to push foreign policy and military issues away from the consciousness of the voter. And the campaigns are just reflecting what's on the voters' minds.
So this is
Just to throw a few more factors out, politicians are afraid to look weak.
Yeah.
So they have to support a strong military to be credible given that consensus that has prevailed so far. And I would think there's also the interest that the United States has in maintaining power over other parts of the world for economic benefit as well as perceived security benefits. You put all that together and it's a pretty strong force that says it's better to have a strong military and to flex those muscles than to take a chance on reevaluating, which is what we're asking. I mean, it's a big row to hoe to question that consensus and say, isn't there a better way economically, in terms of our relations with other countries, in terms of not getting into conflicts where we do more harm than good to ourselves and others, where there are better ways to build security, to experiment with that, which it would be considering our history. So it's a hard road to hoe, but we're hoping that seeing the results of this approach, where we think we have to change the regimes in these countries and we can go in and fix problems with a military approach. And what comes of it? It doesn't work. It causes more problems for the people. You've destroyed a country. We can't rebuild it. And what does it do to our relations to other countries around the world, and especially in those regions? It's not a win situation for anybody. So we're hoping that this will be a moment when people can actually question that consensus, the fear-driven, profit-driven, tradition-driven maybe, of USA, we have to do it all. We have to be number one or else we're in trouble. That doesn't need to be the way to relate to the world.
And without a citizens group activating, folks across the country to oppose these types of policies, you're not going to get any type of change at the top, because
citizens groups. Let's
citizens
make it
groups,
plural, because
there
are groups that have been saying this.
Sure.
Our thought is maybe they could actually start getting together with and the way I've been envisioning it is, if you have in the center people in the, let's say, Republican, Democratic mainstream that have gone along with this consensus, we must have strong military, we do need to intervene in order to be strong. And you start to raise those questions on the fringes. You start wherever you can, within those parties, other places in the business community, other places in churches where people are going to question it. And that if it can catch on enough so that it becomes newsworthy, it would lead to other people raising those questions, other people coming out, coming forward and saying, from the military, the foreign service, these folks are telling the truth. We can't go on like this. These are the results. There is another way. And that's what it'll take, is people saying there is another approach that would be more realistic and more effective.
A lot of folks who have criticized American foreign policy and the high degree of militarism in American society have kind of questioned the military's role in the economy, okay? I mean, this is a large amount of money that we're spending in the economy. What would replace it if we were to just stop funding the military? I mean, it does consume a lot of high-tech goods and services. It does create a lot of technological development that can also sometimes be repurposed for civilian use. What steps into that place and creates that type of demand, creates that type of innovation?
Well, I would ask you what stepped into that demand in the mid-90s when we de-scoped a lot of our military infrastructure. I don't recall a big depression in the United States in the 1990s when we did that. There's a lot of this stuff can be converted rather rapidly from military to civilian use, and a lot of the personnel are interested in taking the skills that they learn in the military and going out into the civilian sector and making some money. So we don't have a military to provide jobs for our people. We have a military to protect us from external dangers.
The perspective from the left over the years has talked about economic conversion. Mm-hmm. And that first of all, we're not talking about disbanding the military anyway.
Right.
We're talking about a transition, which would be a gradual process. But in this transition, studies have shown that, for instance, government spending for other types of services than military create more jobs, better for the economy than military spending. And what's happened is military spending, because of the fear motive, has caused us to make these great expenditures, which do put people to work, put money in the pockets of corporations. It does, those things. That's not the only way to have a strong economy. And in fact, there are better ways to have a strong economy than to be based on, and communities that have seen their bases go away realize that those are temporary types of things anyway. Well, but that there are better ways to use our resources. And people on the right would also say, if you didn't tax people as much, we'd have a better economy for another reason.
Right. So, I mean, in the resolution, you all say investing in America. I mean,
yeah, that's another way to use this
social
dividend
services,
from making
hospitals,
these changes.
Schools.
Yeah.
And from the right, we're talking about tax cuts possibly, and a lot of this is funded by debt spending.
Yeah, and that's an example of left-right convergence right there, because we don't necessarily agree on what should be done with that money.
Right.
But we agree that money should be available for other purposes. We're not arguing that we should compromise on the security of the United States to the slightest. What we're saying is we can provide the same amount of security, or perhaps even more security, for less money. And it would be wonderful to have the problem of deciding between the left and the right what to do with that extra money.
See, and that's a real discussion to have. That's a real political argument to have, rather than having to fight these different interventionist wars every 10 or 15 years. Yeah. We've got less than 5 minutes. And so this is our opportunity.
How did this happen, Brian? How did this happen?
This is our opportunity to talk about how people can get involved. Because y'all are a pretty new organization. I think the website's been up for a month.
We formed after the conference last April, and so we're going on a year now. We spent our time so far in a small group looking for those points of agreement, left and right, so that we could come up with a resolution. And now we're really ready for people to sign on, either just formally to say you agree and you think this is a good idea, and that's a very good thing, and we're going to be reaching out to all kinds of groups and individuals. But we're just a handful of people, and as you can see, we've taken on a very big order, even if we're just looking at Houston, and actually we've started to communicate around the country. hoping that other groups will be inspired by what we do, that we can link up around the country, because there are folks like us everywhere. We'd love to have people in Houston say, that sounds like a unique project. I would like to put some time and energy into that, and we would definitely like to meet with them, and we need those folks.
One other thing I would say that would be helpful at this point, if someone wants to get involved, if you're part of an organization that could legitimately have a say on this, and that could even be your local political organization, for example, please take a look at our resolution and see if you would endorse it. We'd be happy to collect a large number of people at all levels, from the guy down the street to the guy in the office halfway across the country with a huge budget, and everything in between, to look at this, endorse it, and get on board.
We're doing research and writing, which we'll be putting up on our website, where we're going to try to flesh out these issues from our resolution. We need people that like to do that sort of thing to help us with that. We're hoping to start making public presentations. If your group would like us to make a presentation, put that on our website information to us, or give us a call and leave us a message. And we're going to start doing that. We need to make that PowerPoint projection, and we need some folks who would like to help us make the presentations. You might be the person we need, including online social media support. We have a few good people, but that's a big part of what we need to do, and we could sure use some help with that.
And education is really a vital component of this, because there's been 60+ years of a militaristic drumbeat when it comes to American foreign policy, and you've got to take steps to counteract that.
Absolutely.
We have been talking about America's foreign policy with the Houston Foreign Policy Alliance. We've been joined by Jeff Larson and Bob Henschen. They are members of this very new group. If you would like to get involved in their fight to change America's foreign policy, their website has been on the screen. You can also give them a call. Thank you very much for being on the program.
Thanks you, Brian.
Thanks for letting us on.
For everyone here at GreenWatch, this is your world. Take care of it.
Here they come, international loan sharks, backed by the guns of marketing military profiteers, whose word is a swamp and whose brow is smeared with the blood of the poor. Who rob life of its quality, who render rage a necessity, by turning countries into labor camps, modern slavers and drag as champs.
Thank you, Brian. This was our first little in-depth.
Sinister and cynical instrument who makes the gun into a sacrament. The only response to the deification of tyranny by so-called developed nations, idolatry of ideology.